Well, welcome to another session of the Kitchen Table Conversations, where a group of us folks, men folks, are having conversations about what it means to be men and our ways in understanding masculinity and shaping new meanings and understanding about that. Pheng here, he, him, his. This is our 48th episode for those who've been watching us and continuing to watch us. Thank you so much for the continued engagement and support, whether it is live in this moment or thereafter. But I'll give it to my other folks here to share in a little bit, and then I'll toss it back to me to sort of start off the conversation on what we're going to be talking about today.
Roderic, he, him, dialing in from St. Paul.
Hello, everyone. Felix Martinez, pronouns he, him, and his, or él in Spanish. Super happy to be here.
And hey, everybody, my name is Sean Hayes. My pronouns are he, him, and his, coming to you from Duluth, Minnesota at Minnesota Peacemakers. Happy to be here.
Again, so appreciative of everybody and all of you, Felix, Roderic, and Sean. It's been a while since I want to recognize we didn't have a show last 2 weeks ago because we weren't able to. And so it's been a while that the four of us have been together, probably a month or 2 months now, I would say. And now we're streaming through StreamYard. And so that's another platform that allows for us all to engage with you all directly as comments come in and you watch us. So definitely chime in and join in on the conversation with us here today, or any other times as well too, and let us know what conversations we should be talking about or what you're thinking about and that we can talk about moving forward. October, and so being this is like our second or third year, I can't remember it now, doing this, it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month as well. So we are 6 days into it already. Obviously, for those of us who are doing this work around domestic violence and in domestic violence, we're always constantly thinking about it. So October is just a month for us to really, I think, put down and raise real visibility around it, right? So that there's more awareness and more understanding about it every year, even though we do it every day. So there's tons of events, I'm sure, that are happening throughout the state and in other states as well too. So please pay attention and join those events, whether they be Walk a Mile in Her Shoe. I know that they still do that here and there. Candlelight rituals that they do as well too. I know that the Violence Free Minnesota, the state coalition of multiple organizations who work on domestic violence, just last week released their annual domestic violence homicide report. I don't see it on their website yet for the 2021 report, but I do see it from the 2020 report is on there as well too. They started collecting domestic violence homicide statistics since 1989 in the state. So if any of you are interested or want to understand and know more about it, please go to that site. We'll put it in the description as well too, so you all can access it and take a look at it. Besides that, we have this coming Monday, Indigenous Peoples Day on Monday, obviously. So it's very important, obviously, that we are all on Indigenous land and that we recognize the Indigenous sovereignty and the lives and contributions of Indigenous folks who are still here and who are still thriving the best that they can. And then it's also Latina and Latino Cultural Heritage Month as well too. So that is something to think about. So many things, two things to really celebrate and honor in terms of the Latino community and Indigenous folks, and then to really raise visibility around domestic violence as always. And I think we always take this time and opportunity to really have the conversation around domestic violence, because it's really important that we take, even though we talk about masculinity throughout the year and manhood throughout the year and how we navigate those things, I think that when it comes to this time of the month, we really push hard, at least in this kitchen table conversations or these kitchen table conversations, to really have the conversations that are necessary that men and masculine folks could be having and should be having within their own private homes and or networks or within their buddies and peers as well too. So nothing too much, but I would just wanted to throw those things out and see what jives and what lands and where what lands with all of you here, and we'll go from there in terms of the conversation as always.
Hello, everyone. Felix, you like as you mentioned, Pheng, Latino Heritage Month, something as a Latino that bring a lot of pride and happiness to me. That start from September 15 to October 15. It's celebrated obviously in the United States to recognize the contribution and the influence of Hispanic Americans to the history of the United States. So obviously our culture is something that we always try to embrace, something that me as a father, I always try to encourage my daughters to embrace, also to learn, to hopefully keep those traditions from generation to generation. Something that we need to be proud, not something that we need to feel like for example, as a Latino, as a Puerto Rican, not feel comfortable speaking my language here in the U.S. So it's something that brings a lot of pride. There's been a lot of people in history that have marked, the history of the United States that bring a lot of pride to us, and something that we love to celebrate, and we take this month in order to do that. So you're gonna see a lot of parties, a lot of fiestas everywhere, a lot of different communities having parties in different countries, continents, celebrating their culture. So if you have a chance to stop by and learn a little bit, feel free. We're super nice people. We love other cultures too. And if you have a chance, just stop, learn, have some foods, have some drinks, and don't be afraid, to learn something new. I think we appreciate that. In the same way, us as Latinos, we also embrace other culture and we celebrate other cultures, heritage too. So if you see something, a fiesta somewhere, stop and just say Felix sent you. No, don't say that. I don't want to get you guys in trouble, but I think it's a great opportunity to do that. So super happy to be celebrating this month, and that doesn't mean we only need to have 1 month to celebrate it. We should celebrate it the whole year. But I think this is the month to be proud and post stuff online and let other people know you're proud of your culture, of your heritage, and your language. And yeah, so it's a little bit of that.
I just wanted to chime in on that too. I appreciate Felix you sharing about that, and wanted to wish you also a happy Latinx Heritage Month. And to share too that as I've sort of been scrolling social media over the last month or so, I follow a group that I think is based either in St. Paul or Minneapolis, but they go by Tigers, which stands for Transgender, Intersex, Gender Expansive, Revolutionary Resources and Services. And so they're just this group that I follow on Instagram, and they have been featuring a different Latinx person each day who are trans or gender nonconforming. And so I've just been able to learn about a lot of community members who folks who are alive today, folks from the past who, have always been doing the work. Yeah, so I just wanted to highlight that group because I think they're great, and I've just been learning a whole lot just by, someone in their team is sharing the information, and it's like you said, there's so many opportunities to learn, which I always appreciate.
Yeah, and going back to the Latino Heritage Month, I think Silvia Rivera was one of those pioneers in the movement. She was a trans woman, Venezuelan Puerto Rican pioneer of the LGBTQ movement. So something for us as a Latino, obviously that bring a lot of pride to you that we're also being part of that movement, and a movement that keep growing up, and we're still fighting. So super happy for that.
I think it's also a good time to just remember sort of the complications of our stories collectively. And I think that, earlier before we got on air, we talked about sort of one story not being enough, right? And I know the idea of our celebrations, the recognition months, is to try to foster, right, different narratives and different stories. And I also think that it's kind of interesting in the way that life is complex, right? That we have these celebrations, and at the same time, uh, these observances of domestic abuse, right? I think this is kind of interesting that we have those sort of things to celebrate and grow and go deeper in, and other places we also need to go deeper that aren't celebratory, right? And that they're happening kind of all at the same time, sort of, kind of, if you will. I think that and doing things, I think, at the intersection of them would prove really fruitful.
Yeah, I think just those kinds of positioning is, I think we often have named that in our conversations here at the kitchen table, is to really name those ways in which things are just a position sort of next to each other. And then like the contradictions in it, and then the tensions that may arise in it as well too, or the joyful opportunities to your sharing there, Roderic, about the intersections of what does this look like and what does this mean? Because we do know that even though as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day and Heritage Month, we also understand that Indigenous women and femme folks are the ones who are the most trafficked, sex trafficked in this country, and who are often murdered on Indigenous land and have no way to actually seek justice or get justice. I know that one of our sibling organizations, MUSAC, is oftentimes talking about murdered Indigenous, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they always have a rally on February 14th of every year. And I'm sure they're going to have another one this coming year in 2023 as well too. And so it's really funny to be able to do those things of like, how do we honor and yet at the same time really give voice and give space to amplify what's actually happening in those communities as well too. I also want to share that to some of what Felix was talking about, is that in any diaspora, whether it be the Asian American group or the Latino group, our Indigenous folks, is that we come from so many different places. But I think the uniqueness of Latino folks is that you all have a shared language. Whereas like for Asian American folks, we don't. We just all come from one continent only, but we don't have shared languages or shared cultural backgrounds or customs in any way, similar to, I think, Indigenous folks in some ways too, where they speak different languages as well too, right? And so I think that that's one of the complications of living here in this society, is how we group people into different groupings so that it simplifies everything. But the disaggregation of that data or those communities is really important to be able to understand who in those communities are impacted systemically by oppression the most, or by violence, in this case, in this conversation, the most, right? And then when we don't do that, then what we don't see is, we don't see the impact of violence, for example, in that community, and what shape it looks like, or how it's taking place in that community, or in the different communities that are embedded in that community. And I think that is very, very important as well too. And obviously, thank you, Yvette, for your comment that yes, gender-based violence does impact communities of color at a higher proportional rate as well too. And always the statistic is always 1 in 4 across any communities, but we also know that it is much more higher in communities of color because it goes unreported, right? Most of it goes unreported because of the way in which people view the police system and the criminal justice system as well too. So I just wanted to name that, and I think that and I want to recognize that not everybody who is Spanish speaking is from Mexico or from Guatemala or from whatever country we're talking about these days that are quote unquote crossing the borders illegally, quote unquote, and that they're coming from all parts of the world, right? And that they have their own customs and traditions. And I think to Felix's proud Puerto Rican background is that is its own identity in itself as well too. And I think what's coming to my mind now is like the indigenous folks in Puerto Rico that I've witnessed and seen that I've come, and they're indigenous, right? They're indigenous folks, and they have been mixed with some Spanish-speaking background and blood, I would say. And I think Kareen, who we had here a while back, Kareen um, from Tewa Women United in New Mexico, is always tells us is that they've been colonized twice. First by the Spanish, and then second by the English folks, right? And so they've been colonized twice, and so I think that is something I'm always in the back of my mind. I'm always thinking about is that kind of impact in for those communities and what's happening, right?
Yeah, thank you, Peng, for sharing that. When you mentioned, like the natives, of Puerto Rico, it's just a pretty much really low percentage left on the island. They're pretty much non-existent just because of that, colonization, oppression, and it's a mix. Our DNA is a mix now from Africa, obviously, the natives of the island and Spanish. So that's something that, for example, I had opportunity to go to Mexico for first time this year, and I was able to go and see the pyramid and see the culture, and it made me think about why we don't have that in Puerto Rico. Obviously Puerto Rico was exploded, by the Spanish, the Spanish, and that's a reason why we don't celebrate anymore. That Christopher Columbus discovered America, because it's nonsense. I think history shows a different story. With time, the more we learn, it makes us realize that's not something to celebrate, especially when so many natives died because of that. So it is an opportunity for us to learn, a little bit about our history, the pressure that still exists till this day, in a lot of the countries in the world, and especially in the USA, especially for Latinos, that a lot of them experience also gender-based violence or experience violence, but just because sometimes we don't speak the language, sometimes because we think there's no rights that protect us, we stay silent. Also because also sometimes we try to protect our loved ones, because sadly to say, but a lot of the times when there's acts of violence in individuals, most of the times by people that are close to them, a family member, a neighbor, or someone like that. So I think it's very important to use also these spaces to create awareness about this type of situation, people that are more vulnerable to be victims of that, and what we can do, to make a difference, what we can do to stop those cycles of violence. So through this conversation, we can do that. Nobody deserves to be abused, exploited, or anything like that. We all are human beings and deserve to live a life with respect, with honor, and loving each other, not because of the color of our skin, not because the language that we talk, because we're just human beings. And that's something that I do as a father of two daughters. I want to be sure my daughters have the same opportunities that I have as a man. And that's something that I fight every single day for that. And I want to try to make a difference, having conversations with my family members that they don't normally talk about these type of topics. I try to bring them to the kitchen table conversations, or the dining table, and try to create awareness, something that my parents never did, but I want to try to make a difference. I try to do it that way, by reading, learning, and I'm not an expert, but I feel every day that I have opportunity to talk to people like Roderic, to Pheng and Sean. I'm always learning something new. So never be scared of learning. Never be scared of making that first step, because sometimes by bringing this conversation, you never know when you can create a safe space and also save someone of continuing being exploited or abused by someone else.
Yeah, when I hear you say that, Felix, about like we can continue to educate ourselves and learn about like these nuances, learn about the complications that we find within the different communities. I remember back to when I first started doing this work and, you know, really getting kind of a crash course in domestic violence. And it was like, you know, night and day from what the ideas that I had already in my mind of what is domestic violence, you know, based on what I see in the media, in the news, you know, those things. You know, like I remember watching this movie when I was in maybe high school that I think is called Enough, with Jennifer Lopez in it and some other actor, and she plays a survivor of violence, and it's this really, you know, kind of action full movie where she fights back against her partner who's, you know, using violence against her. And it's like they got that part right about it. It's usually someone who's very close to you that is using violence, whether that's your partner or an uncle, another family member, or even friends or neighbors. But you know, the way that Hollywood and our media glorifies and sort of creates this image of what that, you know, what a domestic violence survivor looks like, you know, being chained up and bruised and beaten and all of these things. And it's like, it doesn't usually show up that way, because then these folks would get caught. So I think there's like this very secretive, quiet way that domestic violence makes its way through our communities without us necessarily seeing those warning signs or red flags or what have you. And I think a lot of people probably have that sort of same understanding that I had prior to coming into this work, you know, that it's like, oh, well, no one really is experiencing this. No one I know is experiencing domestic violence. And I really think about that a lot, and I wonder how many of the people that I know and love are or have experienced some kind of violence in their lifetime, and we just don't talk about it. And so it continues to be this, you know, underlying violence that continues to just plague all of our communities. And then each community with the compounding layers of oppression that folks face. It's like the trans folks that I know in my community who have dealt with violence and who have come and shared their stories with me would never once consider calling the police to report that violence. It's just not even an option, because as you can imagine, all of the stereotypes and these things are beliefs that these police also hold. And there's just, I don't know, it's very complex, and I wish more people would take the time, you know, especially this month is a great time to kind of do a little bit of deeper digging into what this looks like and how it shows up in your community.
You know, something that I wanted to share as a connection point of like understanding about just violence in general and how it happens from one community to the next. Agent Orange was used in the Vietnam War, right, in Southeast Asia, not only in Vietnam, but in Laos and in Cambodia as well, too. And it has devastating and long-lasting impacts on people who have been impacted by Agent Orange, and that people didn't know, right? People who were living in the jungles of Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia didn't know. They just thought that it was rain, right? Because it was coming down as yellow rain. That's what they called it. But before it was actually used in the wars in Vietnam, I should say, and in Southeast Asia particularly, it was actually tested in Puerto Rico, right? Agent Orange was tested in Puerto Rico, and I forgot that area, Felix, the area by where the airport is, and where all the enslaved folks had escaped to, that area, and that was actually the testing site for the U.S. to test Agent Orange in Puerto Rico. before you actually launched it and used it in the wars in Southeast Asia, actually. And so you never know the kinds of histories that we have been a part of, or that how we have been connected already. Like I think we always talk about how we are all connected, and as a value of this conversation, and understanding that sometimes we never think that we would be people halfway around the world. My ancestors or my grandparents would be connected to Felix's people in Puerto Rico through Agent Orange, right? And that is the connection. And then I think the other part of it too that I want to say, that diverts from that a little bit to Sean's point there, is about how the portrayal of people who have been impacted by domestic violence is often people who are innocent looking, people who have no criminal background, people who have done nothing, right? People who fought back but couldn't really fight back. But that's actually not what many domestic violence survivors actually look like, right? And we feel more sympathetic somehow. Somehow we feel more sympathetic to survivors who have bruisings, survivors who we know fought back, who have clean quote unquote records and clean backgrounds, and survivors who tend to have criminal backgrounds, or who tend to fight back really hard, or who may have killed at some point the person who was harming them. We tend to not be as sympathetic to those survivors as much, right? And I think that that's real, because we've seen that clearly. I think it brings me back to that Hmong case. Karina, I believe, is the survivor a few months ago, where she had killed the person who was abusing her for 10 plus years, I believe, that they were in a relationship. So her ex-husband may be a victim of a domestic or a homicide, but he's not a survivor of domestic violence, because she is. When we look at her history and their history in that relationship, we can understand that she is the survivor of domestic violence. And obviously, it doesn't give her the right, quote unquote, to kill him. And yet, it also gives us an understanding that we know that 80 to 90% of women who actually go to prison and are locked up are often the result of domestic violence and sexual violence, because they were trying to stop the violence, because nobody else was stopping it for them, right? Nobody else was actually stopping it. And I think people always tend to say to our conversation here, I'm like, why didn't you call the police, or why didn't you do this? It's so easy for us to judge. But I kid you all not, and I think you all know this, but I think it's really important for us to always put this out there, is that when you are caught up in a very, very violently toxic relationship, it is very hard to untangle from that. It is not easy. Let alone if you think about healthy relationships in which people are trying to divorce. Divorces become ugly because people get to places where they actually don't want to talk to one another. I haven't seen many real divorces where people separate and have good closure. And I think that that's one of the things that I've learned with working with people who've been in relationships, whether it is healthy relationships, unhealthy relationships, toxic relationships, not toxic relationships, violently toxic relationships, or relationships that have not been violently toxic, is that we don't learn and we don't know how to have good closure on our relationships, meaning we don't know how to end relationships in healthy ways, whether it is a relationship that is very healthy or whether it is a relationship that is not healthy. We don't. It's easier for us to end, quote unquote, a relationship that is very violently toxic, quote unquote, and unhealthy, because there's measures and there's markers of like, this is why I'm going to leave the relationship. But even for healthy relationships, it's really hard to even find good closure in those relationships as well too, right? And I would welcome people to actually push back on that, but I haven't seen many. in the last 20 years that I've done this work, working with people and folks, and we do, and I think that that's something that we should all learn, is how do we have good closure, right? And I think that that's something that when I was doing therapy was very important for me to actually be modeling and mirroring to the person I was in therapy with, was to learn how to have good closure in our relationship, like to end the relationship in a good way, with the person having some integrity, I have some integrity, or if we were in an intimate relationship, to teach people how to have good ends and good endings to their relationships, regardless of how the relationship is, in some ways, if you can, right? If you can. Um, and so I think that that's one of the things that I have learned over the years. And at the same time, I also know that we've got to move away from the understanding that just because a person doesn't fight back doesn't mean that nothing has happened to them, right? Or that they haven't tried things out, or that they deserve what's actually happening to them because they aren't fighting hard enough, right? They know, people tend to know, people know how to navigate the violence. Some survivors stay in relationships because then at least they can understand the violence and when it's coming, and then they can maneuver around it or whatnot. Some survivors do all they can to actually get away from the person who's harming them, and they put in all the correct measures. And I always share this case as like, and this is just one, but there's many other cases where this survivor had done everything correctly, by the book, called the police, got an order for protection, got systems and alarm systems in their house, everything. I kid you not. Gun. At the end, they were killed. Their new partner was killed as well too, by their ex partner, who was the person who was harming them. So, um, so we can do everything by the books, and still, yet the violence isn't going to stop. And in order to actually stop the violence, I think to some of the things that we often talk about here at the kitchen table is we all have to actually name it visibly, and we all actually have to identify it visibly, so that there's more people paying attention. So if I were the person who was harming in community, if we are all in community together, and if we're in the same neighborhood or same church congregation or whatnot, you all would be like, hey, we know Pheng, we're watching you, right? So that there's more eyes and ears in community about what's happening. And I think from many of the domestic homicide cases that I've seen, and we've heard about, is that there's many family members who actually understand in some ways what's happening, but don't have the skills or the knowledge of how to actually navigate that violence or to stop that violence from happening, right? So then, therefore, survivors take it into their own hands to say, hey, nobody else is going to stop this violence. The only way out is either I die or the other person dies, right? And it's sad to say that it gets to that place, but I'm sure that that's what goes through some survivors' minds. And that's what some of them have shared with us as well, too, is like the only way in which this relationship is going to end is either that person dies or I die. That's the only way, right? Or we both are dead, you know? And people who've caused violence have shared that with us as well too.
Wow. So, wow. Wow. So, in the conversation about comments about sort of the connection, right, between Agent Orange, it made me think of this book called I think it's called The Empire That Was Not, or How to Keep an Empire Hidden. And sort of this the common hand of the U.S. in these places, right, that is perpetuating kind of similar things in many places that are said to kind of stand alone, right? They're said not to be their former colony, and I just thought, wow, that's interesting. So that's what it made me think of when you said that. But it also made me think of a time when there were a couple guys who were together, I guess, for a while, And one of them was like, hey, I'm having a hard time appreciating my partner. And I was like, huh. And so I was like, okay, I should kind of be really sort of like a cheerleader, like, have you considered this? Have you considered this? And so I went through this litany of like, hey, well, blah, blah, all the stuff you do to kind of say, have you, to in my mind, encouraging them to see the sort of the positive sides of like this and, kind of like, just the whole machination of things. Then, like a couple months later, I run into a common friend of ours and she's like, they're in an abusive relationship. And I'm thinking, I spent literally a lot of time saying, oh, I'm sure there are ways, you guys are just not getting along that well. Didn't even occur to me, right? Because of how, your comments about sort of what I would look for as signs, right? And this person not being what not exhibiting things that I would have been like, oh yeah, I should say this to you, right? And I didn't, perhaps I didn't have the curiosity, right? I was too sort of like, that relationship is aspirational for you, right? And so I'm going to make it aspirational for me, as opposed to, digging in different ways to go to perhaps, uncover like, oh yeah, that it's more complex and that's going on. I had no clue. So as you were talking about sort of the absence of sort of things that we sort of live and die by in terms of signs, I was like, oops, I've done that. And so that was that came to visit me while you were talking about that.
I think that, Roderick, to what you shared there, is one of the biggest lessons I learned from working with people who cause violence, whether it be domestic violence or sexual violence, is best thing is, I think, yes, to encourage them and to just only talk about them and their behaviors and actions, right? And for people who caused harm, oftentimes they will always say the responsibility is on the other party, meaning that they'll throw blame on the other party most often. And so in the conversation, that tends to be like a signal to me or a red flag to me that there might be some abuse happening in that relationship. I don't know from who, but what I tend to do is I tend to just focus in on that person's behavior. Like, what are you doing? How are you feeling about that? Let's take some time to process that a little bit. Where do you sort of like unload that anger or that frustration that you're sharing with me, or that sadness? Where do you put it? And how is it coming out? So I tend to just focus on them and their process, what's happening inside of them, and less about the other party, because I don't have enough information about the other party, and because I'm not talking to the other party. And so I think that that's one of the lessons I've learned, again, from working with people who've caused harm, is just focus in on their behaviors, their emotions, and emotional well-being, and their intellectual and psychological thinking and well-being as well too. Um, and they'll, whether they start focusing on themselves or keep focusing on the other person, may give you some clue as to whether there's actually violence happening in the relationship or not, because survivors can oftentimes think about the person who's abusing them often, very often too, of like, he's constantly doing these things and these are the things that he's doing and I can't. And people who are causing harm will often talk about the other party as well too, of like, they're doing this constantly, and if they didn't do this, I wouldn't have done that, so it's their fault, and it's not sometimes that visible or frank, but it takes a lot of skills. And I always encourage people to sit with people who've caused harm, because they will teach you how to identify and how to move. But that's one of the biggest lesson, again, is to just concentrate on that person, whoever's sharing with you about what's happening in their relationship, and just talk about them and their relationship to the relationship, not their relationship to the other person, or not about the other person as well too. And even with survivors, we don't talk about the person who's causing them harm as well too, right?
I think this is making me think about a conversation recently I just had with someone in the community who was struggling, with their relationship and had come to me sort of as like a friend to vent to. And it's interesting that it's coming to mind right now because there wasn't any, they didn't mention any express, you know, specific violence that had been used, but just that, that they were struggling in their relationship. And it kind of like it makes me think about this question of like, yeah, how do we know, if there's violence happening and who, which person is the one who's, actually enacting the violence? Because, generally speaking, we know it's usually one person who is, using more of that violence. And, I've also been in situations where I, believed friends of mine and then later learned about violence that they had been using. And so it's like in those moments, even, for someone like me who has not been doing this work for quite as long as, Pheng or, a little over 5 years, it's like I still struggle to know, what is the right question to ask? And, would it make sense for me to just directly ask this friend of mine, like, has violence happened? Either, from their side or your side, or, and so it's just the other part of this is it makes me think about like the complexity and how I think folks in general struggle to have deeper conversations. Folks lack like energy, and maybe we don't have that close of a relationship, and so we're not spending as much time connecting with them. And these are really difficult conversations, I mean, to have, even for someone who's doing the work, And so to know like the right thing, quote unquote, and it makes me think that, most folks not doing this work every day, maybe would just have that thought of like, oh, I wonder if something's happening there, but not necessarily know how to ask about it, or think, well, I don't want to, insert myself into their, you know, life or family or whatever. And so just, yeah, it's like, how do we have conversations um, about it when we don't know what folks are experiencing, or what they're surviving at home, and then they're coming, um, and maybe are not talking about that, what they're going through. And so it's complex, and it's hard to know how to help. And I think most people, want to be able to help. And then like, what do we tell them? Like, what's the thing to say?
Absolutely, Sean. And something that when I talk to my daughters or when I talk to youth, I always try to go to what's a healthy relationship. Sometimes if we don't know what's a healthy relationship, we don't start detecting those red flags on time, we're gonna fall in that. We're gonna fall in love with that person. We always gonna think, oh, Felix will change. He maybe had a bad day, and maybe he pushed me today, and he'll never. He promised he'll never do it again. Next time he'll probably do a little bit more than pushing. We keep thinking that he loved me. I'll be fine. We're okay. He doesn't hit me as much as my dad used to hit my mom. So when you start growing in relationships like that, and you see around you that they normalize that type of behavior or that unhealthy relationship, that's some of the root causes of of domestic violence and all this of abuse and everything. I think we need to start having this conversation about what's a healthy relationship from you're a little kid, just having those conversations with kids. So we detect and we realize, what's okay, what's not okay. I think jealousy sometimes is normal, and some people say, well, he's jealous because he loves me and he's protecting me, when in reality, it's not. I think everybody deserves to have their space. Everybody deserves to have friends. Even if I have a wife, I have friends that are females also. But they need to be boundaries. They need to be respect, and you need to show respect to others too. So I think healthy relationship, I think, is a key, uh, in order to help prevent that in the later future. And if you know that someone is being showing some of those red flags, showing some abuse, say, you know what, I'm not going to continue with this relationship. And if you see some of your friends are going through something similar, maybe pull them aside and have that conversation with them. And personally, I have those conversations in the past, and that person have been mad with me because they think I don't understand what the partner is going through, and make me look like a bad person. And when the reality, time show that that person maybe was abusive, and that person maybe didn't have the best intentions. So I think it's important also to think about that, and it's hard, because when you fall in love, sometimes you don't see those red flags, even when they're in your face, just because you hope that that person is going to change. The same reason when it happened in domestic violence or gender-based violence in our community, sometimes we think it's only going to happen once, it's not going to happen again. We don't want Felix to get in trouble, or we don't want Felix to get deported or anything like that. So let's keep it like that. Let's talk to him and it's over. When the reality is more than that. We need to educate ourselves about, what's gender-based violence, all those intersection and how it's seen in our communities. And even when we don't want to call the police because our main goal is to violence to end, it is more complicated than that. So I think we need to have those conversations, even when they're difficult, even when we know that there's someone that we love that's causing harm, but we need to make them accountable. We need to have them, because if we don't do it at that point, that person's gonna think, oh, I can. If I did it now, I can do it whenever I want. And it's those cycles that continue happening. And then if you grow up in a household where violence is there, you you're gonna do it too. There's a big chance you will do it. That doesn't mean it will happen, but there's a big possibility that for you that's your normal. It's okay for me to yell to my wife. It's okay for me to yell to my kid and spank them. Every time they don't clean their room. And it's hard. I grew up in a household where my dad used to hit me for every single thing. Doesn't smell how small it was, but that brought a lot of insecurities to me growing up. I was scared of making decisions just because I said, if I screw it up, my dad is gonna hit me. And Puerto Rico, they hit you with the belt, they hit you with the metal part, whatever, a stick, whatever they found, whatever is closer to your dad, that's the first thing they grab. What we call the chancla, that's the flip flop. The chancla is a big thing in the Latino community. And parents used to hit you with the flip flop or the shoe or whatever. And I personally don't agree with that. And as a father, I think I failed a lot just because I was always scared to put discipline in my house, and I put my spouse to do that part. And my spouse used to come to me all the time. Well, you're so soft with the girls. Or, why are you not tougher? Why are you not backing me up? And it's because probably inside of me, I didn't want to see myself how I used to see my dad. So it's that trauma that sometimes it's on you. You don't realize it till then you start having these conversations. So start learning a little bit more about it. So then you realize, like, wow, I didn't realize, I did that. And now I have the opportunity to have this conversation with my parents and my other men in my community. And I personally have been able to see a change in my dad in behaviors. I seen him speaking up when he see someone being unfair. So it shows you that there's always opportunity to change. We just need to show love. We need to show compassion and do it, with care, and let them know that, in reality, we're not all perfect, but we all have opportunity to make a change, not in ourselves, but in the world. So I love always having this type of conversations, because it's that, there's always someone listening. They're gonna say, you know what, I never realized that, but now that I'm listening to Sean or Roderic, I said, yeah, I can see that, and there's always something I can do. Let me take that first step. So
And I think it's always, you know, um, It takes more than one conversation, but if it's only one conversation that you have with that person who's doing the disclosing or whatever they're sharing with you that's going on in their relationship, it would be, worthwhile to follow up with them as well too, to just see what's going on and what's happening, and like, hey, is there anything I I think about how we wouldn't ask direct questions, but I think that in that we have to practice that of asking very direct and open and transparent questions, and the people always have a choice to answer, to not answer, and you can always preface it with like, you can answer, you don't have to answer, but I will have no judgment whether you answer or not. And so I think it goes in with that as well too, and it depends obviously on the way in which you are in relationship with that person, as well too. But I would say that because most of the relationships that we are in some ways are more than acquaintances, when people come to the place where they're sharing what's happening in their relationships with you, I think that it's incumbent upon us, or that we have a responsibility and a way to say, can we be holding something with you here, so that we can help uh, you unload some stress, or what's going on here, that I can emotionally help you untangle here in some ways, so that you can feel a little bit more relief or some opening or whatever. And so even when I talk to people who have caused harm, and I know them to cause harm in community, but not been identified through criminal justice system, or they're still in relationship, I would still walk with them, and they'll call me up, and I won't obviously be a friend of theirs or whatnot oftentimes, but people have given my phone number out to folks, and people would call me and be like, hey, can you talk to so and so who's related to so and so, or a friend of a so and so, and I'd have a conversation with them, and I would again really concentrate on them and what they're doing and what's happening and what support they could get, and really follow up with them as well too, right? Because then it helps us stay with them, and stay with them in the present moment, rather than trying to throw it somewhere else in terms of the conversation. But it is a hard struggle, I would say, and it takes a lot of skills, to Sean's point, and it takes practice for us to do it. And I think that that's why we really have to equip our friends and families with some advocacy skills, and I know that Minnesota does require people to get a 40-hour sexual assault, um, to go through that training to become a sexual assault violence advocate. But that training, I think, is really good and really useful. And there's a domestic violence training, advocacy training that's done, the 101. Those are really helpful. And I think really good skills. Even if you're not going to become an advocate, it's good skills and good knowledge to have, so you can practice on how to navigate the violence when it shows up in your family, because you're going to be the first one, right? We are oftentimes our family's first people to hear about it or to see about it, and our friends as well too. And so it's really important for us to actually have some understanding of that, to Felix's point. So I just wanted to leave with that, and I know we'll continue the conversation, but I'm super appreciative of all of you, and definitely celebrating Latino folks and Indigenous folks in the next few days and months and years.
And I see that we're nearing the end of our conversation here today. So, Felix or Roderic, if either of you had final thoughts, we'd love to hear them.
Thank you, Sean and Pheng. Super grateful of having the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you guys. And well, thank you, everyone. If you know someone who's experienced violence, feel free to look for help. There's a hotline available, so you can always search. If you know that person is in real danger, always 911 is always a phone number to dial in case of that person is in life is in risk. But don't be afraid of have these difficult conversations. And thank you, Roderic, Sean, and Ben, for yeah, for the chance to speak with all of you. So thank you.
Ditto.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm definitely feeling grateful for this conversation, and I've got some ideas too to follow up with this person in my life. So I'm grateful to Pheng and each of you for helping me navigate through this life in a good way, in a healthy way. And I really, I can't, and I believe none of us really are meant to do this on our own. So just feeling extra thankful for each of you and for having this conversation with me and with all of you who've been able to tune in, whether you stopped in for a couple of minutes while we were live or whether you're catching up later with us on YouTube. We're just grateful that you are connecting with us, that you're wanting to be a part of these conversations. And we just encourage you again to start them up at your kitchen table or dining room table or wherever it is, with the folks that are around you in your lives. So thank you again for joining us for today's 48th live kitchen table conversation. We want to thank our funding partners, as always, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Minnesota, as well as the Novo Foundation for all of their support. And our next conversation will be 2 weeks from today. So we hope you'll be able to join us on Thursday, October 20th at 12 p.m. Central Time. And as a reminder, don't forget to like our Facebook page, find us on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and that way you'll get all the updates about when we're coming live and what we're talking about together here. So thanks again, and we hope you all take good care.